At my son's wedding, the bride looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not family anymore. Please leave." I paid for that wedding. I funded the celebration I was thrown out of. But what I did next burned everything down. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next jaw-dropping episode. Willow Creek in late October was a hush of amber and rustling gold. The cottonwoods along the river had turned into flickering lanterns of fire, shedding their final leaves with a kind of soft dignity. The chill in the air wasn't biting yet, just enough to remind you that the days were shortening, the nights settling deeper. And on a narrow street near the old mill road, in a white timber house that creaked with every gust of wind, Margaret Lane stirred quietly in her kitchen. The house smelled of cinnamon-browned butter and baked apples. A warm fragrance clung to the worn wooden floorboards and open cupboards, where old copper pots still hung in proud display. The kitchen was small, but it held decades of stories within its tiled walls, stories simmered into broths, rolled into pastry, and whispered between wooden spoons, passed down through generations. Margaret, now 74, moved through this space like a memory come to life. Her back was slightly curved from years of leaning over cutting boards and stovetops, and her hands bore the burns and ridges of someone who'd lived a life wrapped in heat seasoning and exactitude. She wasn't fast, but she was precise. The rhythm of her movements, measuring flour, folding dough, brushing egg wash across a braided crust, was almost meditative. She wore a navy cardigan with flour dusted across one sleeve and a faded apron that had once been a gift from her husband James. A navy ship, embroidered on the front, had frayed over time, but she never wore another. The apron made her feel like he was still there just beyond the kitchen door, perhaps tightening a bolt on his old motorcycle or fiddling with the radio. James had been a sailor in his younger years, a man with calloused hands and an endless trove of stories from ports she'd never seen. He had a low laugh, the kind that warmed a room, and a way of describing storms that made you feel you were right there with him, salt in your lungs and waves crashing at your back. He passed 7 years ago, a quiet stroke in his sleep, and since then the house had gone silent in a way that even her radio couldn't fix. Margaret placed the apple tart into the oven, clicked the door shut, and leaned both hands on the counter. She closed her eyes. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room, followed by the groan of the old refrigerator. Outside, leaves scraped across the porch, like polite visitors too timid to knock. She walked to the pantry and retrieved a small box tucked behind sacks of flour. A wooden box scratched and dark with age. Inside were Polaroid's letters and newspaper clippings from James's years at sea. She picked one him, standing in front of the USS Mohawk Wind, tossing his unruly blonde hair, a crooked grin on his face. "You'd laugh at what passes for fish stew these days," she murmured aloud, her voice soft and gravelly. "Some influencer calls it oceanic broth and adds chia seeds." She placed the photo beside the stove. The phone rang its chime, short, curt, cutting through the haze of memory. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room to answer. "Hi, Ma." Sean's voice chirped through, too loud, too bright, as though he were already mid-sentence in another conversation. "We're coming up Friday. Thought we'd spend the weekend. It's been too long, huh?" Margaret's heart gave a flutter, half joy, half dread. Sean, her only son, had been living in Bozeman for the last 10 years, busy with real estate ventures and whatever new startup ideas he dreamed up. Visits had grown sparse. He always called, but it wasn't the same. You couldn't taste a voice through a phone. "That's wonderful," she replied carefully. "Will it be just you?" A pause. Then came the voice light as spun sugar, carefully pitched. "Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention Veronica's coming too. She's dying to meet you." Margaret blinked. "Veronica." The name sounded like gloss and ring lights. "She's really excited," Sean continued. "She's been planning to vlog the trip. She wants to do a segment on heritage cooks. You'd love it, Ma. It's all about old-school recipes, legacy flavors. You'd be perfect for it." There was a strange silence in Margaret's kitchen now. Not the silence of loneliness, but of calculation. I see, she said softly. When exactly do you think you'll arrive? Friday, probably mid-afternoon. Veronica has a brand meeting in the morning, but we'll head up right after. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. All right, I'll have something ready. After they hung up, she stood motionless for a long moment. The refrigerator groaned again. Outside, a wind picked up, sending a flurry of golden leaves tumbling across the porch. Margaret turned back toward the stove, the weight in her chest sitting heavier than before. She began to clean the counter, clearing away bits of apple peel and pastry scraps. Then, in slow, deliberate movements, she opened the tall cabinet above the fridge and pulled out her old guest tablecloth. She unfolded it on the kitchen table. Its lace edges were slightly yellowed, and there was a small wine stain from Christmas 3 years ago. She smoothed the fabric with the palm of her hand. Next, she walked to the cupboard and retrieved her mother's silver cutlery set. She hadn't used it in years. As she polished each fork and spoon, her mind wandered Veronica vlogging. Lights cameras in her kitchen. Her recipes turned into content. Would she rearrange the spice rack? Would she correct Margaret's plating? She exhaled sharply. No assumptions. Veronica might be lovely. She might surprise her. But a voice within her, low, hard one born of decades of intuition and time in hot kitchens, whispered, or she might not. Margaret set down the silver cross to the sink and stared out the window. The backyard was overgrown now. James used to tend the garden. He'd planted rosemary for her, and even though he was gone, it still grew in tufts along the back fence, stubborn and fragrant. She would roast chicken with rosemary on Friday, and garlic mashed potatoes like when Sean was 9 and wouldn't eat anything green, and the apple tart, Sean's favorite. She'd make everything from scratch. Let Veronica taste what real food meant. Margaret dried her hands, reached for a notepad by the fridge, and began to scribble a grocery list. Her writing was small, tight like her thoughts. Chicken thighs, russet potatoes, fresh thyme, heavy cream, Granny Smith apples, lemon zest, cinnamon sticks. And wine, a bottle of good red, something bold and dry, just in case. Then she paused, stared at the pad. At the very bottom she wrote, smile, listen, observe. She underlined observe twice. It was dark outside now. The sky a deep navy blue pressing against the windows. Margaret turned off the oven and pulled the tart out, its crust golden and bubbling at the edges. She placed it gently on the cooling rack and lit the small candle by the window. The flame flickered, dancing in the glass like a small heartbeat. She returned to the wooden box, opened it again, and slid James's photo back inside. She added something new, a Polaroid of her and Sean at the old lake picnic when he was maybe 15. He had braces and wore a floppy fishing hat. She was laughing, holding a sandwich in one hand, her other arm slung across his shoulders. The photo was worn at the corner's edges, curling like autumn leaves. She placed the box back behind the flour and closed the pantry door. And then, without a word, Margaret moved toward the stove once more, lit a fresh burner, and set a pot of water to boil. There was more to prepare. There was always more to prepare. The knock came just as the last of the autumn light dipped behind the ridge. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and took one final glance at the table. Everything was where it should be. The roast chicken rested on its ceramic platter, surrounded by a halo of rosemary and lemon slices. The mashed potatoes were whipped to velvet, dotted with cracked black pepper and butter, pooling in gentle golden puddles. Apple tart was cooling on the sideboard, its crust glistening under the dimmed light. It wasn't just dinner. It was her way of saying, "Welcome home." She walked to the door, her pulse quickening. When she opened it, the first thing she saw wasn't Sean. It was a phone, or rather a phone mounted on a sleek gimbal pointed directly at her face. Behind the screen stood a woman, tall, polished, dazzling in a cream trench coat and knee-high boots, with glossy dark hair cascading over one shoulder. Her smile was wide, perfect, too bright for the dying light behind her. "Hi, guys," the woman said into the phone. "We've just arrived at Sean's childhood home, and here she is. The woman behind the legend, Margaret Lane." "Say hi, Margaret." Margaret blinked. Sean stepped in from behind, sheepish but grinning. "Mom, this is Veronica." Margaret's eyes flicked from the phone camera to Veronica's outstretched hand. She took it, felt the faintest pressure, firm but fleeting, like shaking hands with a mannequin. Veronica kept her other hand on the gimbal the entire time. "Lovely home," Veronica said, eyes scanning the hallway. "So vintage. It's like Wes Anderson meets American Pie, in a good way." "Dinner's ready," Margaret replied, stepping aside. "I hope you're hungry." As they entered, Veronica panned her phone across the living room, narrating every detail in a sugary voice. "Check out this antique wallpaper. And these beams. Are you kidding me? This place is such a vibe. Guys, comment if you'd want to Airbnb a weekend here." Sean gave Margaret a little shrug, mouthing, "She's just excited." Margaret offered a tight smile. She could feel her face stiffen in ways it hadn't for years. By the time they reached the kitchen, Veronica had set up a small tripod near the window, her phone locked in place like a third guest at the table. She adjusted the angle twice, then tapped the screen and beamed. Margaret stood at the head of the table, arms crossed behind her apron. "I thought I'd make some of Sean's childhood favorites," she said. "Roast chicken with rosemary, creamed potatoes, and apple tart for dessert." "Oh, that's adorable," Veronica said without looking up. "Very authentic. I should have worn my rustic sweater. Missed opportunity." She pulled out a chair and sat brushing invisible dust off the linen napkin Margaret had ironed earlier. Sean poured water for everyone and tried to ease the tension. "It smells amazing, Mom. Brings me back to Saturdays after soccer." Margaret served them, slicing the chicken carefully, plating with a grace Veronica barely noticed. The meal began with clinking forks and the occasional hum of approval from Sean. He reached for seconds of the potatoes just like he used to. But Veronica... She picked at her chicken, then paused dramatically. "I'm trying to go semi-keto," she explained, tilting her face toward the phone's lens, "so I might just have the salad." "It's not a salad," Margaret said evenly. "It's parsley and pickled onions, a garnish." Veronica laughed light and sharp. "Then I guess I'm doing garnish tonight." Margaret watched as the young woman repositioned her camera to get a better angle of the plate. She took a single bite of chicken and then immediately lifted the phone to record herself chewing. "Wow, that is so nostalgic," she said vaguely. "It tastes like Grandma. Not my grandma. Just, grandma energy." Sean chuckled nervously. "She means that in a good way." "I didn't say it was bad," Veronica said quickly. "Just hearty. You can tell it's from a different era." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "It's the same recipe I made for Sean every birthday until he left for college." Veronica smiled. "Aw, so sweet. It's like dinner with history." She tapped on her phone, checking the comments that began trickling in on her live stream. "Ooh, someone wants the recipe," she chirped. "Margaret, do you mind if I link your email? Or is that too much?" "I'd prefer not," Margaret said coolly. "This isn't a brand." The temperature at the table dropped a degree. Sean cleared his throat. "So, Ma, there's actually something I wanted to talk to you about," he said, eyes shifting between the two women. Margaret already knew that tone. It was the one he used when he wanted something, not the small things like rides to school or $50 for gas. The bigger things, the real asks. She set her fork down. Sean straightened in his seat. "Veronica and I have been thinking, dreaming really, about opening a place together. A restaurant." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A restaurant?" "Not just any place," Veronica jumped in. "An immersive dining concept. Heritage flavors, but elevated. Your recipes would actually be the inspiration." "We want to call it Lane," Sean added, "in your honor." Margaret blinked. "We'd source locally, work with regional growers," Veronica continued. "And we'd do this fusion between legacy and modernity. I'd handle the branding, outreach, and content, obviously, and Sean would manage the operations. It would be—" "Let me guess," Margaret cut in. "You need funding." Sean smiled gently. "Just to get started. The banks want too much up front. But if we had your backing—" "How much?" He hesitated. 120. Margaret let the number hang in the air like steam off the roast. Then slowly she leaned back in her chair. Veronica, misreading the silence, pressed forward. "But you wouldn't just be giving us money. You'd be part of it, a partner. You could even be a culinary consultant." There's this whole series I've been planning, Margaret Lane, the legacy chef. People love grandmother figures who can throw down in the kitchen. We'd shoot it in soft light. Get you some signature aprons. I'm not a mascot, Margaret said. Veronica blinked. No, of course not. I just meant, Margaret turned to Sean. If I lend you that kind of money, it won't be blind. Sean nodded. Of course not. We'd show you the business plan. I want oversight on the menu, on the kitchen, on everything. Veronica's lips parted in a small O. I mean, that could work, as long as it doesn't slow things down. Margaret's gaze sharpened. It will be slow. Real food is slow. If you're building this on fast clips and camera angles, then you don't need my money. You need a set. Sean looked away. Margaret reached for her wine glass, took a sip, and breathed in through her nose. The scent of rosemary lingered in the air. I'll think about it, she said at last. I'll need to see the plan. Real numbers, not mood boards. Sean gave a relieved smile. Thank you, that means a lot. Veronica raised her phone again, just capturing this moment of agreement, generations coming together over a dream. Margaret didn't smile. The rest of dinner passed in small comments and long silences. Veronica asked about lighting in the guest room. Sean tried to bring up a podcast he liked. Margaret finished her tart and listened, eyes fixed on the flickering candle between them. When they finally left the kitchen, Margaret began clearing the plates. Alone again, she stood at the sink, hands under warm water, eyes distant. The chicken had gone cold, but something else had just started to heat up. The next morning came bathed in gold, the kind of filtered sunlight that made the kitchen glow like a memory. Margaret had been up since 6, kneading dough with the precision of someone who had done it thousands of times. The room smelled of yeast salt and patience. A fresh pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, the mugs arranged neatly hers, Sean's and one with Queen of Content etched in gold cursive, Veronica's no doubt. Margaret had just set the cinnamon rolls into the oven when Veronica waltzed in, phone already in hand. Oh, don't move, she said excitedly, pointing her camera at Margaret. That light is insane right now. You look like a goddess of bread. Margaret blinked. I'm not quite camera ready. Veronica grinned. That's the whole point. Raw is real. People are over filters. They want authenticity. You in this kitchen making magic, that's the story. Before Margaret could object, Veronica had hit record. Hey fam. So this morning, we're in the heart of Willow Creek, where culinary legend Margaret Lane is making cinnamon rolls from scratch. No mixer, no shortcuts, just decades of love and technique. Margaret turned slightly, wiping her hands on her apron, trying not to roll her eyes. They're just rolls, dear. But Veronica wasn't listening. She was too busy narrating, angling her phone to capture the steam rising from the oven. The soft lighting, the rustic kitchen tiles faded at the edges. Isn't this everything? She beamed at her viewers. Comment if you think we should convince Margaret to do a weekly baking series. Mornings with Margaret. Tell me that isn't genius. Margaret forced a tight smile. Let me know when I can stop being scenery. Veronica laughed, not unkindly. You're not scenery, you're the soul. I'm just here to showcase you. But the moment the phone turned off, the sparkle in her voice dulled. She put the phone down, stretched her arms, and casually inspected the counter. This tile, she muttered, running a manicured finger along the grout. It's kind of grandma core. You ever thought about renovating? Margaret arched a brow. I like my kitchen the way it is. Veronica shrugged. It's cute in a nostalgic way, just not, viral. She poured herself some coffee, added almond milk from her travel-sized carton, and sat at the table. The camera now idle, the charm drained from her like a leaking balloon. By the time Sean entered, yawning and shirtless, the energy in the room shifted. Veronica's voice rose an octave. Babe, I told you this place is a whole brand. I got the cutest footage this morning. Sean kissed her on the cheek and smiled at his mother. Something smells incredible. Cinnamon rolls, Margaret said. The way you like them. No nuts, extra icing. He beamed. You remembered. I always do. They sat together eating in relative peace. Veronica snapped a few more photos, Sean holding the roll. Margaret smiling behind him, the kind of manufactured moment that would be posted with a vintage filter and a caption about home-cooked roots. But underneath, Margaret could feel it, the disconnect. Like the glaze on the rolls, everything had a sheen, but nothing truly stuck. Later that afternoon, Margaret joined them in the living room holding a worn recipe notebook. "I've been thinking," she began, flipping pages. "If you're serious about this restaurant, I'd like to help shape the menu. There are some classics that could work beautifully: chicken fricassee, braised short ribs, peach cobbler." Veronica raised her brows. "That's sweet, but we're aiming for something more conceptual." Margaret frowned, meaning like deconstructed pot pie or reimagined brisket. "Think bone marrow ice cream, edible floral arrangements, that kind of thing." "Bone marrow," Margaret repeated. "In ice cream. It's a thing," Veronica said confidently. "Nose to tail is trending hard, and people love unexpected twists. No offense, Margaret, but no one's going viral over meatloaf." Margaret set the notebook down slowly. "People don't always want a twist. Sometimes they want comfort, honesty, something that reminds them of who they were before the world got noisy." Veronica smiled, tilting her head. "But that's your story, not the brand's." Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned to Sean. "What do you think?" Sean looked like he'd swallowed something sharp. "I think we need to blend both worlds, old and new." Veronica jumped in. "Exactly. We honor tradition while making it sexy." "Sexy," Margaret echoed. "That's what food is now." "To some people," Veronica said, unbothered. Margaret gathered her things and rose from the couch. "I'll be in the garden. The rosemary's overgrown." As she stepped outside, she heard Veronica giggle, whispering something to Sean. Her son laughed lightly, and that somehow hurt more than the rest. That evening after dinner, while cleaning up the kitchen alone, Margaret heard faint voices from the guest room. She didn't intend to eavesdrop, but when she passed by the half-closed door, Veronica's voice was unmistakable. "No, babe, you don't get it. She's sweet, but the woman is stuck in the 70s. She still handwrites shopping lists. Her spice rack has paprika from the Clinton administration." Sean laughed. "Come on, be nice." "I am being nice," Veronica said, laughing too. "But if we let her run the kitchen, it's going to be casseroles and guilt trips. I love the woman, but she's like a prop, a cute, crusty little prop. Just smile, nod, and let her think she's involved." Margaret felt something fold inside her. She stepped back, the floorboard under her heel creaking slightly. The voices inside the room stopped. She turned, walked away quietly, and went straight to her bedroom. She closed the door, locked it, and sat on the edge of the bed. There was no rage, not yet. Just the slow recognition that the curtain had slipped, and behind it wasn't just vanity or ambition. It was contempt. Later that night, Margaret returned to the kitchen, unable to sleep. She paced for a while, then went to the counter where Veronica had left her vlogging equipment earlier. The tripod, the LED ring light, and the small pouch marked backup SDs. She stared at the pouch. Then carefully, methodically, she opened it and pulled out a micro SD card labeled Day 1 Raw. She slid it into her laptop. Folders bloomed open, organized, labeled, time-stamped. Veronica was thorough, she'd give her that. Margaret clicked on one marked Kitchen Intro BTS. The video loaded. Veronica was in the kitchen, standing in front of the dough bowl, practicing her lines. "Hey fam, we're in the rustic heart of Willow Creek with a living culinary legend." Cut. Ugh, I said that already, delete. "Okay, take 3. She tried again. "Good morning. We're here with Sean's mom, the original queen of carbs." Cut. Then came the third take. Veronica rolled her eyes before the camera started. "God, I feel like I'm standing in a time capsule. If I catch tetanus from this whisk, I swear." And then laughter. Not just hers, Sean's too. "I can't believe we're doing this," Veronica said off camera now. "It's going to take months to rebrand her style into something we can sell. We'll have to work around her, like she can smile, bake a pie, and then quietly fade away. Mute her audio or something." More laughter. Margaret's hand slowly moved toward the pause button. She stared at the frozen image. Veronica with her perfect makeup holding a spoon like a stage prop. Sean lounging behind her, grinning like he didn't realize the price of the moment. Margaret didn't cry. She reached for her own flash drive from the desk drawer and copied the file. She watched the progress bar fill one green pixel at a time. When it was done, she pulled the SD card from her laptop, placed it back exactly where she found it, zipped the pouch, and closed the drawer. She sat there a moment longer in the dim blue light of the kitchen, while outside the trees rustled gently in the dark. The face they wanted her to wear had cracked, and they didn't even notice. But she did. and now so would they. The first time Margaret set foot inside the restaurant space, it was still just a hollow skeleton, exposed brick, loose wiring, concrete dust clinging to the floor like a film of doubt. It didn't smell like food yet. It smelled like sawdust ambition and half-spoken promises. Sean led her on a tour with wide gestures and hopeful eyes. "We're calling this area the Concept Bar. Chef's counter over there, open kitchen behind it. It's gonna be sleek like New Nordic meets Montana rustic. You'll love it." Margaret nodded absently, her eyes catching the shape of the yet-to-be kitchen stainless steel counters, waiting to be mounted, a massive induction range still wrapped in plastic walls, unpainted and raw. It felt too clean, too sharp, not like a kitchen but a set. Veronica was walking ahead of them, clicking through photos on her phone, barely looking up. She wore heels that echoed through the emptiness like gunshots. "I'll handle the layout flow," she said, not asking. "Lighting's crucial for the live shoots. I'm thinking overhead ring plus track LEDs. We'll soften it in post." Margaret's gaze lingered on the wiring in the ceiling, her mind already calculating angles, shadows, blind spots. That evening, she drove to an electronics store 2 towns over. She didn't go to Willow Creek's local supplier. No questions, no gossip. She purchased 2 small, discreet security cameras. One disguised as a smoke detector, another built into a USB charging port, both wireless, both feeding into a private cloud account she registered under the name M. Lark. The next morning, she returned to the restaurant early, using her key while Veronica was still out filming autumn aesthetic B-rolls at the nearby lake. She took her time installing them, one high in the corner of the prep station where the line cooks would soon work shoulder to shoulder, and another aimed at the storage area where Veronica had already claimed space for her media room. Margaret didn't rush. Every screw, every placement, every inch mattered. When she was done, she wiped her hands on her jacket and whispered, "If they want a show, I'll give them the raw cut." By the following week, the kitchen was alive with clanging steel, hissing burners and the low murmur of new hires trying to stay invisible. Veronica had begun training the small team, 2 line cooks, 1 pastry assistant, and a bright-eyed sous chef named Cora. Margaret noticed her the second she stepped in. Petite frame, high cheekbones, a nervous energy that pulsed beneath her politeness. There was something achingly familiar about her. It wasn't until the first break room meeting that Cora approached Margaret directly. "Mrs. Lane," she said, voice trembling just a little. "I'm not sure if you remember me. I took your culinary class at Bozeman High. 10 years ago. You used to bring us lemon bars every Friday." Margaret blinked, then broke into a slow smile. "Cora Langford. You cried over burnt bechamel." Cora flushed. "I've never lived that down." Margaret chuckled. "And yet here you are, not just stirring sauces, running a line." "I owe a lot of that to you," Cora said earnestly. "This job, when I saw it was you involved, I thought finally something rooted, something real." Margaret's smile dimmed. That afternoon, she watched from the edge of the kitchen as Veronica swept in wearing a tan jumpsuit and oversized sunglasses, barking instructions with the confidence of someone who'd only read about kitchens on Pinterest boards. "No, no, no," Veronica snapped. "That's not how you plate the beet puree. You swirl it. It needs drama." "But we're just testing fire response time," Cora started. "I don't care. Everything's content. You don't get a rehearsal in this world, sweetheart." Veronica gestured toward the overhead camera. "That angle's tight. If your hand's in the shot, it better not look like it's been washing dishes for a decade." Cora's face flushed a deep red. Margaret, arms folded, leaned silently against the walk-in freezer door. She didn't say a word. Not yet. The footage from that day streamed into Margaret's tablet that night. She sat at her dining table with a glass of white wine and headphones and watching. Veronica berated one cook for not smiling enough, told another to wear more photogenic gloves, told Cora she had a tired posture and needed to straighten her back, like someone who wants to be noticed. When a burner misfired and sent a puff of smoke up toward the ceiling, Veronica yelled at the building inspector over the phone and then blamed the staff for making the test run look ugly on camera. Margaret paused the video. Her face in the soft glow of the screen was unreadable. She opened a file folder on her desktop, labeled it Archive, and saved the footage there. By the end of the second week, Margaret had collected over a dozen clips. In one, Veronica told a dishwasher, "People like you should stay out of sight. No one follows a brand with grease under their nails." In another, she told Cora, "You know, with better skin, you could be my understudy. You've got that struggling girl aesthetic people love." Margaret made no announcements. She said nothing to Sean, but she began to notice how different he'd become too. He no longer asked for her feedback. Meetings with Veronica ran late into the night. He started showing up to the kitchen in sport coats and wireless earbuds, always on a call. He brushed past her sometimes without a word, looking through her rather than at her. One morning she handed him a tasting spoon of her corn chowder, one of his childhood favorites. He took a bite absently. "Good," he muttered, then turned away to answer a text. She stared at the back of his neck, the silence between them stretching longer than the steam rising from the bowl. At home, her house began to feel like a ghost town. The smells of food lingered, but not joy. Her routines became muted, early mornings without chatter. Late nights spent watching the footage from the cameras, trying to piece together not just evidence, but understanding. She didn't want to destroy anything. That wasn't it. She wanted clarity. And perhaps if she was honest with herself, she wanted Sean to see what he was too busy to notice. One day in the break room, Margaret overheard a conversation between Cora and another cook. She wasn't eavesdropping. The walls were thin and the door had been left open just enough. "Did you hear what she called me yesterday?" Cora whispered. "A brand liability. Said my accent made us sound backwoods." She said that. She said I was only here because her fiancé had a soft spot for his mom's charity cases. Silence. Margaret walked away without saying a word. But that night she flagged the footage, labeled it, backed it up twice. In the kitchen, the cameras watched as Veronica wielded her cruelty like garnish, artfully placed always with a smile for the background music. Sean didn't see it, or didn't want to. He was in love with the vision, the brand, the future they were curating. And Margaret, she was no longer part of that vision. She had become a fixture, an antique left in the corner, revered but no longer heard. Until now. One night she stood in the middle of the empty restaurant alone. The countertops gleamed under the motion lights. The air smelled faintly of burnt oil and citrus polish. She looked around at the perfect symmetry, the camera placements, the brushed gold faucet, the touchscreen order system. And she whispered to the room, "You don't know what a kitchen is." The room didn't answer, but somewhere in the cloud the footage waited, and Margaret Lane had the key. Friday evening arrived cloaked in ceremony. The restaurant's facade, now gleaming with polished brass and hand-painted signage, cast a golden reflection onto the brick sidewalk. Candles flickered behind the frosted windows. Uplighting bathed the name Lane in soft, moody hues. Everything had been curated to feel timeless and expensive, an illusion of legacy, as Veronica called it. Old soul with a new lens. Inside, the tables had been set with matte black dinnerware custom name cards and polished silver cutlery that Veronica had insisted on importing from Copenhagen. Jazz played through hidden ceiling speakers, carefully selected tracks that evoked sophistication but not familiarity. Even the scent in the air had been engineered, a faint blend of burnt sugar and sage mist puffed discreetly through a hidden diffuser behind the host stand. Margaret stood near the kitchen pass-through, adjusting the folds of her white coat. She was dressed like every other cook on the line, anonymous in pressed whites and hair tied back. There would be no place cards with her name tonight. No spotlight. No speech. Veronica had made that clear during the prep meeting that morning. "Margaret, we'd love for you to be here, of course," she'd said. Lips glossed, tone syrupy. "But the story tonight is about the brand. We don't want to confuse people by introducing too many voices. Simplicity sells." "Do I get to meet the investors?" Margaret had asked. "Oh, definitely, just maybe not in the presentation portion. After dinner, casually. You know, organic moments." Margaret had simply nodded. But now, as the first guests filed in, coats draped over their arms and designer heels tapping across the terrazzo floor, she felt the weight of the moment settling on her chest like a brick. This restaurant had been born from her recipes, her money, her name. And tonight she would serve plates through a window while someone else performed her history. Behind the line, Cora adjusted the garnish tray and gave Margaret a quick glance of solidarity. The two shared no words, just a look. They understood the same language, now the language of women expected to disappear behind their labor. At 7:05, the lights dimmed and Veronica stepped onto the small stage at the far end of the room. She wore an ivory silk dress that hugged her frame like an ad campaign, and a lapel mic barely visible beneath her collar. Her voice poured through the speakers like warm Chardonnay. "Good evening, friends, creators, investors, and visionaries," she began. "Tonight is not just a dinner, it's a revelation. It's a reimagining of heritage through flavor. A celebration of bold simplicity rooted in legacy and elevated for the modern palate." Margaret moved back behind the kitchen window, eyes never leaving the woman holding court at the head of the dining room. She watched as Veronica spun the narrative of love tradition innovation, of rediscovery, of laying the restaurant that bridged generations of taste. She was a mother, a mentor, a muse, Veronica said, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. "And I'm so proud to be bringing her spirit into the future with Sean, my partner in business and in life." The room broke into polite applause. Margaret's hand tightened around a plated duck confit. She passed it silently to the runner, then turned away from the window. She had waited long enough, retreating to the tiny manager's office behind the walk-in freezer. Margaret locked the door, pulled her tablet from her bag, and connected to the private archive. Her fingers moved with steady precision. She selected one video. The thumbnail showed Veronica, eyes narrowed, sneering at Cora. Audio synced to that frame. "You're just here to make my shots look better, so stand up straight and don't breathe like a victim." Margaret uploaded the file, opened a draft email, and typed slowly. Subject: "For your consideration regarding Veronica W. Dear Mr. Solberg, I hope you'll accept this in confidence. As a mother, I tried to stay silent. As a partner, I can't. What you see tonight is not the whole truth. Please watch this clip before making a decision. Margaret Lane." She attached the video, added 2 more clips for context, and hit send. Her hand hovered over the mouse pad after, not trembling, just still. A moment later, she heard the door behind her rattle slightly. Cora's voice, "Chef, they're plating the second course." Margaret opened the door and nodded. "I'm coming." Back in the kitchen, the staff moved with mechanical efficiency. The seared trout resting on sweet corn velouté went out with precision, but the air had shifted. Margaret felt it. 10 minutes later, she watched from the prep window as one of the investors, Mr. Solberg himself, checked his phone, frowned, and whispered something to the woman seated beside him. He stood slowly, not rudely, but with finality. He tucked his napkin onto the table and adjusted his blazer. Veronica, mid-laugh with a tech reporter, spotted the movement. Her smile faltered. "Everything all right, Mr. Solberg?" He looked at her for a beat too long. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant. No handshake, no goodbye. Just silence. The door whispered shut behind him, and the room for a breathless moment stopped breathing. The clink of silverware seemed suddenly too loud, the music too curated, even the light flickered. Veronica blinked, then smiled too brightly. "We all know founders have early exits," she said to no one in particular. "Busy men, busy deals." But her laugh didn't reach her eyes. From behind the window, Margaret watched, not with triumph, not with smugness, but with the cold, clear clarity of someone who had finally stopped hoping to be seen and started choosing to be heard by other means. Later in the alley behind the restaurant, Margaret stepped into the night air and lit a single match, not for fire, just for light. She watched it flicker, then die in the wind. The evening had ended, but the reckoning had just begun. It began as a whisper. 2 days after the soft opening, Veronica's phone lit up with a notification she didn't recognize from a private investment group newsletter, usually hidden behind paywalls. She tapped it absently while getting her lashes done in the upstairs loft of the studio she rented for product shoots. Inside was a headline: "Brand built on legacy, or lies Lane's PR narrative called into question after internal footage leak." The article was short, more speculative than accusatory, but it referenced a confidential video circulated anonymously among several early investors in Lane, suggesting ethical concerns regarding workplace conduct, staff treatment, and misrepresentation of the brand's culinary leadership. The air left her lungs like it had been vacuumed out. She immediately texted Sean. "What the hell is this?" But Sean didn't reply. He was already buried in it. At that very moment, he was sitting across from the lead investor of a tech-backed hospitality accelerator who had gone dark since the night of the soft launch. The man had agreed to meet at a neutral cafe near Bozeman, not the restaurant. That in itself had been the first red flag. Now he sat with arms folded, his latte untouched. "We were prepared to put in 250, he said evenly. "But after what I saw, I think we'll sit this one out." Sean's throat tightened. "Saw what?" The man tilted his phone toward him, letting a still frame linger. Veronica glaring at the camera mouth mid-sentence. Cora in the background looking like she wanted to disappear. Then he stood. Sean didn't even get the chance to speak. By the time he got back to his car, 3 more emails had come in too from micro-influencer partners requesting to pause collaboration, and one from a PR rep canceling a brand integration campaign scheduled for launch the following week. He drove in silence, both hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Meanwhile, Veronica paced the upstairs hall of their apartment in workout gear she hadn't broken a sweat in. Her phone buzzed with a rhythm she could no longer control. Notifications from sponsors, questions from her manager, 2 DMs from concerned fans asking if the rumors were true. Then came the call from Loom Agency. "Hi, Veronica. We're postponing the Soft Beauty Box launch until this settles. We love your platform, but we can't be attached to unverified conflict right now." She forced a bright tone. "It's all lies, troll content. We're investigating." But when she hung up, she sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the floor like it had betrayed her. That evening, as the restaurant kitchen simmered with the smell of charred citrus and duck fat, Margaret stood quietly at the back of the walk-in, organizing spices in alphabetical order. She wasn't needed on the line tonight. Veronica had insisted on streamlining faces. But Margaret wasn't here to be needed. She was here to be present. Veronica stormed into the kitchen around 8, cheeks flushed, voice high. "Where's Sean?" office said one of the junior chefs. She pivoted sharply and marched toward the back. The office door swung open so hard it slammed against the wall. Sean sat at the desk, surrounded by silence and a blinking cursor on his laptop screen. He didn't look up. "Are you going to explain this?" Veronica snapped, tossing her phone down on the desk. Video paused mid-sentence. Sean didn't answer. She pointed at the screen. "That's edited. It's out of context. You know how I talk when I'm stressed. Everyone does that. It's not abuse, it's what do they call it, direct management style." Still, Sean said nothing. "Why aren't you defending me?" Her voice cracked now. "You said this was our future. You begged me to make it look modern and polished." He finally turned to her. His face looked older. Not in years, but in wear. "I begged you to respect it," he said quietly, "not stage it." Veronica recoiled like he'd slapped her. "This is your mother's doing," she hissed. "Isn't it? She's been bitter from day one, jealous even. She never wanted this place to succeed unless she got to parade around like Julia Child." Sean stood up slowly. "Veronica," he said, "go home." "What?" "I need space." "You're throwing me out." Her voice rose in pitch. "Just go." She stared at him. "You're seriously choosing her over me." He didn't respond. Veronica picked up her phone with trembling hands, stormed out, and slammed the door so hard it made the frame shudder. 5 minutes later, Margaret knocked once and stepped into the office. Sean sat where he had before, his elbows resting on his knees, hands dangling uselessly. "I take it she saw the leak," Margaret said. He nodded. She closed the door behind her and took a seat across from him. He looked up slowly. "Did you do it?" Margaret met his eyes. "Do you really have to ask?" He sighed, rubbing his face. "She said it was fake, staged, manipulated." Margaret pulled a USB drive from her coat pocket and placed it gently on the desk. "Here's the raw file. No edits. Full time code. Multiple days' worth. Watch it whenever you're ready." Sean stared at the small piece of plastic like it was radioactive. "I wanted this to work," he whispered. "I thought if we blended both worlds, your roots, her reach, it could be something special. And instead," Margaret said softly, "you let her sell your inheritance like a bottle of skincare serum." He looked at her, then really looked. "I didn't know she was like that." Margaret leaned back. "You didn't want to know." There was silence between them, thick and unmoving. Sean reached for the USB but didn't plug it in. He held it between his fingers, head bowed. "You believed in me," he said. "I believed in us," she corrected. I should have protected your name. Margaret didn't flinch. You should have listened. He let out a shaky breath. What happens now? That depends, she said, on whether you want to save a restaurant or salvage your soul. Sean laughed once dry and sharp. Maybe I can't do either. Margaret stood, walked to the door, paused. You don't have to be ashamed of falling in love with a fantasy, she said. But you do have to choose when it's time to wake up. She left him sitting in the dark alone with a blinking cursor and a drive full of truths he could no longer outrun. And outside the world kept spinning. But inside the walls of Lane, something fundamental had shifted. The house Veronica built on polish and filters had cracked, and the wind was howling through. Gomku. The air in Sean's apartment was heavy with silence and whiskey. The blinds were drawn, blocking out the gentle Montana sunlight. Half-filled tumblers stood like little monuments to surrender across the kitchen island and coffee table. An untouched sandwich lay curling at the corners on a paper plate. The only sound came from the soft static of a muted television and the low groan of floorboards shifting beneath his bare feet as he wandered from room to room like a ghost pacing his own ruins. He hadn't returned to the restaurant since the night Margaret handed him the USB. Hadn't opened his laptop either. Instead, he drank. He drank because it dulled the sound of Veronica's voice echoing in his head. He drank because the silence between him and his mother had grown too vast to cross sober. He drank because deep down he couldn't tell if he felt betrayed by Margaret or ashamed that she had done what he should have. And in that haze, the phone calls came. At first from Veronica, then from their shared sponsors, then from reporters he didn't recognize. Each time the screen lit up, he stared at it until it dimmed again. He was done talking. Veronica, on the other hand, was not. 3 states away, seated in the back seat of a town car outside an influencer retreat she hadn't been invited to. Veronica opened her phone and pressed go live. She wore a sweatshirt that said, "Empathy." First, her makeup was perfectly smudged to suggest vulnerability, and her voice trembled just enough to seem unrehearsed. "Hey guys," she began, staring into the lens. "This isn't easy for me to say, but I'm hurting." A pause, a well-timed sniffle. "There's been a lot of talk online, rumors, accusations, and I just want you to hear it from me, not the trolls or the tabloids." She adjusted the hood over her hair, let her eyes glass over. "I trusted someone close to me, and they betrayed me. They took private moments and twisted them, made me out to be something I'm not. I loved that restaurant. I loved that family. And now I don't even know if I have a home anymore." Thousands of hearts floated across the screen. Comments flooded in. "You don't deserve this. Stay strong, Queen. Let them hate, they're just jealous." Veronica bit her lip and looked away from the camera as if overcome. "I'm going to take some time off. To heal. To focus on me. But just know, I never faked anything. Not my love. Not my dream. And definitely not my truth." She ended the stream with a final whisper, "Love louder. Always." The clip went viral within hours. Back in Willow Creek, Margaret stood at the kitchen sink in her own home, watching the video in silence. The screen cast a faint bluish glow on her face. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't curse. She simply clicked the tab closed. The wind outside rattled the windows. A storm was building in the distance, one of those long, slow Montana tempests that arrived with more whisper than roar. Margaret turned away from the laptop and walked to the old wooden table near the pantry. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved a slim, cracked, leather-bound journal. Its pages smelled faintly of rosemary and ink. Her handwriting was small and deliberate, slanting slightly to the left. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. October 27th. The truth burns hotter than any oven. I watched it peel paint from faces, saw it carve silence into a boy I once knew. Veronica has taken her lies and turned them into flowers, and Sean he drinks, but won't swallow what's real. I used to believe that blood meant permanence, that if you shared a table long enough you were tethered by something stronger than time. But truth has a cost, and sometimes it's your own child. Some legacies don't pass down. They get torn in half and used to wipe lipstick off wine glasses. She paused, then wrote one final line. Some recipes don't get rewritten, they get buried. She set down the pen. Outside, the storm had finally arrived. Rain whispered against the roof like distant applause. Margaret walked to the old filing cabinet in the back room and unlocked the lowest drawer. Inside, bundled in a red silk ribbon, were the original contracts, investment agreements, ownership shares, brand licensing, all of it. She carried the bundle to the kitchen, placed it carefully into the cast-iron skillet that once belonged to her grandmother, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, curling through the paper like hunger devouring every clause and signature. She stood over it, eyes never leaving the fire until the last ash fell. Then she took a damp cloth and walked to the wall where the original menu mock-up hung. It was framed in brushed bronze, etched with quotes from Veronica's brand vision, surrounded by faux laurels and calligraphy. She unhooked it, laid it flat, and wiped it clean. Every name, every flourish, gone. In its place, she hung an old chalkboard, the one James had built for her back in 1983 when she first taught cooking to the church youth group. She picked up a piece of white chalk, tapped it against her palm once, and began to write. Next week's menu: simple food, honest people, no cameras. She stepped back and looked at it. It wasn't art. It was intention. And in that moment she realized she wasn't grieving the restaurant. She was grieving the version of herself that had waited to be invited into her own kitchen. In another part of town, Sean sat on the floor of his darkened living room, the USB still untouched beside him. The whiskey bottle was nearly empty. The light blinking on his answering machine told him Margaret had called twice, but he couldn't bring himself to pick up. He hadn't left the house in 3 days. He'd started shaving again only because the razor had stared at him too long from the bathroom sink. He told himself he needed more time. But what he really needed was courage, and perhaps forgiveness, not from Margaret, from himself. Margaret, alone now in her home, placed a loaf of warm sourdough on the windowsill and lit a candle beside it. Not for show, not for memory, just for peace. The rain had slowed and the world smelled clean again. Outside in the dark, the rosemary bushes bent gently in the wind. And in the quiet kitchen that had birthed a dream and buried a deception, Margaret Lane finally sat down. Not to wait, not to watch, but to begin again. The building stood modestly on the edge of Willow Creek's main street, a one-story brick structure with fading blue shutters and a hand-painted wooden sign that read, Community Center, Est in 1954. It had once been a town library, then a polling station, and now functioned mostly as a rental hall for senior craft nights, charity bingo, and the occasional birthday potluck. But this morning, under a sky smudged with late autumn gray, Margaret Lane stood on the front steps of the building with a proposal folded carefully in her hands and something else burning in her chest. Not vengeance, not pride, but a hunger to belong again. On her arm, a worn canvas tote sagged with knives wrapped in linen jars of sea salt and a bundle of rosemary from her garden. Inside the building smelled faintly of dust coffee and old varnish. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Margaret met with Louise Tran, the center's director, a petite woman with reading glasses, and the unflappable patience of someone who'd been organizing bake sales and seniors karaoke since the Clinton administration. "We've got Tuesdays and Thursdays open," Louise said, scanning the typed proposal Margaret had prepared. "Kitchen's outdated, but we've got gas burners, a convection oven, and enough folding tables to build a small fortress." Margaret nodded. "I'm not asking for much, just space. I'll bring my own equipment if needed. I want to offer a class for the elderly, the widowed, the ones who don't eat unless something's microwaved for them." Louise looked up, her expression softening. No charge. Not a cent. Louise folded the paper and tapped it against her clipboard. "You always were stubborn as hell. I remember your sourdough stall at the harvest fair. Folks still talk about that crust." Margaret smiled. That wasn't crust. That was war. They shared a quiet laugh. Louise extended her hand. "Welcome back to service." The first day of class, only 4 people showed up. 3 women and 1 man, all of them over 70. None of them smiled when they walked in. They shuffled awkwardly through the entryway, clutching grocery totes or second-hand aprons. A retired nurse named Evelyn, a former mailman named Bill, 2 sisters, Clara and Joyce, who hadn't spoken to each other since the Eisenhower years and now refused to sit at the same table. Margaret didn't try to dazzle them. She didn't perform. She simply greeted them, handed out cutting boards, and began with onions. "Today we cry together," she said, sliding half a dozen yellow onions across the counter. "Tomorrow we eat." The joke fell flat. Bill coughed. One of the sisters muttered something about acid reflux, but Margaret didn't flinch. She walked them through knife holds, how to dice without smashing, how to sauté without burning. She gave them her grandmother's trick for drawing bitterness out of greens and let them fight over the last ladle of mushroom barley soup. By the end of the session, Clara and Joyce were passing salt back and forth like they hadn't been at war for the past 50 years. The second week, the class doubled in size, and on the third Thursday, a familiar voice called from the hallway just as Margaret was folding parchment paper into baking pouches. "Hope you saved me a chair." Margaret turned and saw Cora wearing jeans, a buttoned-up denim shirt, and the shyest smile Margaret had seen since the girl was 15 and terrified of boiling sugar. "I was thinking you'd never show," Margaret said. Cora stepped inside and took a deep breath. "I wanted to, but I needed time." Margaret handed her an apron. "You've got it. You'll take Thursdays. They're rowdier." Cora didn't ask about Sean, didn't mention Veronica. She simply tied the apron behind her back, tucked a wooden spoon into her belt loop, and stepped into the space beside Margaret like she'd always belonged there. They cooked shepherd's pie with a cauliflower crust, wild rice stew with butternut squash, cabbage rolls like the Polish wives used to make on the east side of town. Recipes weren't followed so much as remembered, stitched together from memory, pain, and longing. Some used too much salt. Others forgot it entirely. But none of it went to waste. People who hadn't spoken to anyone all week now argued over what herbs belonged in meatloaf. Widowers who once ate cold soup from cans now asked for seconds of hot lentils with smoked paprika. There was laughter, slamming drawers, soft singing, and sometimes even stillness, that rare kind of quiet that meant people felt safe enough to just be. One afternoon, Margaret caught Bill slipping the rest of the sour cherry crisp into a napkin-lined hat. He looked sheepish when she noticed. She waved him off. "As long as you don't charge market price, I won't report you." He winked and left with crumbs on his sweater. They didn't film anything. There were no selfies, no hashtags, no polished quotes printed on banners. There were only hands, wrinkled, scarred, burnished with time, moving through recipes like they were prayers passed down orally. There were old records playing through a dusty speaker in the corner. Billie Holiday one week, Glenn Miller the next. And in that kitchen, in that little building with stained linoleum and a crooked door that always stuck in the winter, Margaret found herself again. Not the version Veronica tried to stage, not the brand Sean failed to protect, but the woman who once taught teenagers how to fry eggs without fear. The one who used to bake lemon tarts just to watch a widow's face light up. The one James used to call the last honest fire in the valley. One night after the class had ended and the last dish was stacked, Margaret stood alone, wiping down the counters. The scent of braised leeks still lingered in the air. Cora leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've built something here," she said. Margaret looked around the empty kitchen. The chairs still warm, the chalkboard smudged with the day's notes. "I didn't build it," she said. "I uncovered it." She set down the rag, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind them. And as they stepped into the brisk night air, stars cracked open above them like sugar on crème brûlée. There, under a sky too wide to hold grudges, Margaret Lane breathed in the scent of wood smoke, rosemary, and renewal. No applause, no cameras, just a kitchen full of stories waiting to be told by hands that had never stopped remembering. The air inside the community kitchen that Thursday morning was different. Still warm, still scented with stewed tomatoes and sage, but quieter. Softer, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after holding in something heavy for too long. Margaret stood at the head of the counter, her apron neatly pressed a piece of chalk in her hand. On the blackboard behind her were the words she'd written hours earlier, just before the sun rose. One last bite, a recipe of memory. Around her the tables were already set with cutting boards, cast iron pots, aged wooden utensils, and blank recipe cards with gold trim. She'd ironed the linens herself, even brought in her grandmother's chipped ceramic bowls, the ones with faded blue cornflowers dancing around the rim. They didn't match the rest of the kitchen, but they carried the kind of history no catalog could replicate. 12 students sat quietly, their chatter dimmed by something more reflective. Each was older, slower, a little more bent than the week before, but today they wore their best sweaters, combed their thinning hair, and brought recipes folded into yellowing envelopes or scribbled onto the back of old pharmacy receipts. Margaret cleared her throat. Today, she said, we're not here to learn something new. We're here to remember something old, a taste, a smell, a dish that reminds you of whoever you loved, or maybe just whoever you were. The room shifted, eyes dropped, hands trembled just slightly. Each of you will pick one dish, the one you'd want if this were your last meal on earth. But here's the rule, she added. You have to tell us why. A pause. Then Clara, the more stubborn of the two sisters, spoke first. Strawberry pancakes, she said. My husband used to burn them, always too thick. But he made them for me every Sunday, even when he had arthritis so bad he couldn't grip the spatula. Someone chuckled softly. Joyce, seated beside her sister, murmured, They were disgusting, but they were mine, Clara whispered. And just like that, the dam broke. Evelyn, the retired nurse, talked about her mother's pot roast made with Coca-Cola and Lipton soup mix always served with green Jell-O. Trashy as hell, she said. But she made it every time I came home from college. Bill described venison stew, slow-cooked in a fire pit in his father's backyard, eaten off paper plates under stars, the smoke catching in his coat for days after. That smell, he said, it always meant I was safe. Others followed. A retired florist recalled pierogi with browned butter. A former seamstress spoke of lemon bars that never set but were always devoured. Each story more tender, more raw than the last. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally, placing a hand on a shoulder as voices cracked or fell silent. And then they turned to her. What about you, Margaret? Someone asked. What would yours be? She hesitated, then walked slowly to the chalkboard and drew a single word in wide, rounded strokes. Soup. She turned back to them, her voice gentler now, the kind reserved for memory too full to hold upright. James and I, when we were first married, we didn't have much. He was a sailor in and out of port. We lived in a refurbished tugboat off the coast of Maine. The stove barely worked. The refrigerator wheezed like it had asthma. That drew a small laugh. But every night he was home, we made the same thing, a pot of soup. Whatever was around, beans, barley, carrots, clams, if we were lucky. We didn't follow recipes, just boiled what we had and stirred with whatever love was left at the end of the day. Her eyes shimmered. One night the ocean was angry, rain slapping the windows sideways. The boat swayed so hard I thought we'd capsize, and he just stood at the stove barefoot, ladling out soup like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I asked him if he was scared. He said, Not if you're hungry. Silence filled the room like steam rising from a slow simmer. Margaret's voice grew even softer. So that's my dish. Vegetable soup, made on a rocking boat. Tastes like salt and thyme and the way someone holds you without touching. No one said a word. Not because they didn't have any, but because the moment didn't ask for them. Then slowly Cora stepped beside Margaret and whispered into her ear, just low enough for only her to hear. He's been standing there for 20 minutes. Margaret blinked. Cora nodded toward the back doorway just out of sight, where the shadows bled into the hallway beyond the kitchen. Margaret turned her head slightly, and there, standing still in the sliver of open light, was Sean. Hair uncombed, shirt wrinkled, eyes red not from drink this time, but something heavier, something clearer. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just looked at her, and she looked back. Their eyes locked across the space like they had when he was a child, and had broken something he couldn't fix. Margaret said nothing. She didn't run to him, didn't demand anything. She only turned back to the group and reached for a ladle. Well, she said, voice steady now, I suppose we'd better start cooking before someone cries into the onions. There was laughter again, real this time. The room stirred with life, with motion, with fire. Margaret moved from station to station, gently correcting knife grips, nodding as someone recited a recipe from memory, laughing softly when Bill claimed his hands were too manly for pastry dough. And Sean, he stayed by the door, leaning quietly against the frame, watching. He saw his mother in motion, not staged, not edited, just as she was, the flame she'd always been. He didn't need to speak, not yet, because sometimes redemption didn't start with an apology. Sometimes it started with showing up and staying put. And that day in a kitchen filled with chipped bowls and unspoken grief, a broken man stood still long enough to begin healing. Margaret didn't need to look again. She knew he hadn't left. The next Thursday morning was colder than usual. Frost lined the edges of the old church windows of the community center, and a thin sheen of ice painted the front steps. But inside the kitchen the ovens were already warming, and the walls pulsed with the gentle murmur of conversation, the scrape of chairs, the rhythmic chop of paring knives on cutting boards. Margaret stood at her usual post, hands folded in front of her, watching Cora demonstrate how to segment an orange without losing the juice. The students listened closely, some squinting to see others jotting notes they'd likely never read again. But behind her calm posture something gnawed quietly. She hadn't said a word to Sean, not since he stood in the doorway silent and still watching like a boy peeking through a window too afraid to knock. He hadn't come in, he hadn't spoken. But he'd returned, twice, and now as the clock ticked toward 10, Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward the hallway just as the door creaked open. Sean stood there holding a paper bag with his sleeves rolled up and his hair combed back in the way James used to before Sunday service. His face was tired but open. In his eyes a kind of quiet that could only come after something inside had broken and healed into something softer. "I brought eggs," he said. Margaret didn't move. A few heads turned in the kitchen. Bill raised an eyebrow. Clara paused mid-stir. The room stilled like the pause between thunder and its echo. Sean stepped forward slowly. "And mushrooms, shiitake, fresh ones. I remembered you said they make the best broth." Still Margaret said nothing. He set the bag on the counter, then looked directly at her. "I was wrong, Mom." It was barely above a whisper, but the weight of it pulled the air inward. "I let people turn your name into a logo. I let myself believe your story needed to be packaged for the world to care about it, and I didn't protect you, or the kitchen, or what it meant." Margaret's hands were still folded, her mouth a quiet line. "I don't want to fix anything," Sean said. "I just want to learn and help, if you'll let me." A long silence followed. The room waited, breath held motionless. Then Margaret turned to a nearby drawer. She opened it and pulled out a leather-wrapped bundle worn at the edges, the seams rubbed nearly smooth with time. She slowly unrolled it on the counter, revealing a set of knives. Most had dulled from years of use, but one, the largest, the chef's knife with the dark walnut handle, still gleamed under the fluorescent light. She lifted it gently, then walked it over to Sean and held it out handle first. "Your father used this," she said, "every Sunday, to slice onions for the stew he never learned to season properly." Sean stared at it. Margaret met his eyes. "He never asked to lead the kitchen," she continued. "He just showed up, tied on an apron, and stayed by the stove until the last dish was dry." Sean's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the knife. When his fingers curled around the handle, Margaret let go. A long breath left her chest, slow, deliberate, not quite forgiveness, but the shape of something like it. Behind them, Bill grinned and smacked the countertop. "Well, I'll be damned," he barked. "Been years since I seen a man that nervous to hold a knife." Laughter rippled through the room. "Hope you know how to peel garlic," son Clara called out. "Otherwise we're feeding you to the raccoons." Sean gave a half laugh. "I'll take my chances." Margaret turned back to the cutting board. "We're doing mushroom soup today. Grab an apron. It's not going to dice itself." Sean moved toward the sink, rolled up his sleeves further, and washed his hands. The motions were stiff, unfamiliar, but there was no performance in them now. No camera, no audience, just the sink, the heat, the quiet. Cora sidled up beside Margaret as she chopped scallions. "He's been watching your hands the whole time," she whispered. Margaret didn't look up. "Then maybe they'll teach him something." The day unfolded not with drama, but with rhythm. Sean worked quietly at the side prep station, following instructions, checking twice, asking once. He burned a pan, oversalted the broth, dropped a spoon, but he kept going. And when lunch was served, bowls of rich, savory mushroom soup with cracked pepper and a squeeze of lemon. Margaret watched as he ladled a serving for Bill, refilled Evelyn's water, and sat on a stool beside Clara to ask how she made her strawberry preserves last week. There was something about watching her son in that space, apron stained and sleeves damp, that struck Margaret deeper than apology ever could. He didn't try to reclaim anything. He just showed up. As the last bowls were cleared, Margaret stepped outside into the crisp air, peeling off her apron and letting the breeze kiss the nape of her neck. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. Veronica. She hesitated, let it ring twice, 3 times, then answered. There was silence on the other end. Then the sound of breath. Shaky, performed. Margaret, Veronica said, voice thin. I know I don't deserve to ask, but I want to say I'm sorry. I was scared of failing, of disappearing, and I thought control meant safety. Margaret stared at the sky. A crow crossed overhead, gliding between branches like ink drawn through air. I see you're still calling from private numbers, she said flatly. Veronica hesitated. I didn't think you'd pick up if you saw my name. You're probably right. I lost everything, Veronica whispered. I want you to know I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Margaret's voice was calm but sharp. You meant to own the story, and when it didn't go your way, you tried to rewrite the truth. I've changed. Then change in silence, Margaret replied. Don't turn this into content. Veronica's breath caught. Margaret continued. And next time you try to build something, remember respect comes before revenue. Learn how to sit at someone else's table before you ask for the recipe. She ended the call, put the phone in her pocket, and stepped back into the kitchen. Sean looked up, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't ask who had called. She didn't offer. Instead, she picked up a spoon, dipped it into the last pot of soup, and tasted, then handed it to him. Sean took a sip, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Needs more lemon, he said. Margaret smirked. Told you. Cora laughed from across the room. Bill raised a spoon and declared hallelujah, the man's learning. And as the room burst into familiar teasing warmth, Margaret Lane stood in the center of it, not with armor, not with weight, but with a calm she hadn't known in years. Not everything could be repaired. Not every wound could be stitched closed. But sometimes when the pot is warm, the knife is honest, and the hand beside you doesn't let go, something new begins. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the last one standing. She felt like the first one forward. Snow had begun falling by late afternoon, soft and persistent, covering Willow Creek in a hush so complete you could almost hear the snowflakes touch down. Christmas Eve had a way of slowing time. It muffled the noise of the year, softened sharp edges, and asked just for one night that people sit still long enough to feel what they usually ran from. Inside the community center, the kitchen glowed like a lantern. The dining room had been transformed. The long folding tables were pushed together and covered with white linen sheets Margaret had pressed herself the night before. In the center of each table sat wide glass bowls filled with pine cones, sprigs of rosemary, and flickering tea lights. Mismatched plates had been carefully arranged, each one with a handwritten place card. On the far end, a record player played Ella Fitzgerald singing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," the vinyl hiss and crackle just loud enough to be part of the charm. Sean stood by the counter, tying his apron sleeves rolled to the elbows, face flushed from steam and adrenaline. Margaret moved next to him, a dish towel over her shoulder, hands dusted in flour. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, smiling. Margaret didn't look up. Too late to back out now. Clara already threatened a riot if her duck à l'orange is dry. Sean let out a nervous laugh. "No pressure." "Good," she said. "Pressure ruins dough." The doors opened at 6 sharp. They arrived bundled in scarves and wool cheeks, red from wind and anticipation. Clara wore her late husband's suit jacket, the shoulders far too wide. Joyce wore lipstick for the first time in a decade. Evelyn brought gingerbread cookies in a tin she'd decorated herself. Bill showed up with his grandson in tow, who immediately took over the hot chocolate station with the seriousness of a sous chef. Each person was handed a small menu card as they entered, blank, except for the words, "What would you eat if this was your last meal?" The prompt wasn't new. Margaret had introduced it weeks ago, but tonight it carried weight. Finality. Celebration. They filled in the cards, slowly sitting beneath strings of white Christmas lights draped from the rafters. And once all the menus were handed in, Sean collected them, flipping through each one as he read aloud to the kitchen. "All right," he said, glancing at his mother. First up, Clara's duck à l'orange. 2 votes. Joyce wants creamed spinach with nutmeg and lemon. Evelyn's chosen her mother's pot roast Coca-Cola and onion soup mix and all. Bill wants venison stew. And get this, Cora wants miso glazed cod with daikon pickles. Margaret raised an eyebrow. We've created a monster, Sean grinned. We've got a lot of work to do. And so they began. They moved through the kitchen like a duet. Margaret at the stove, Sean on prep, Cora plating. Dishes rotated through the warming station. The smells layered orange zest garlic, rosemary, soy wine. At one point, Sean dropped an entire bowl of chopped carrots and cursed under his breath. Margaret smirked, handed him a new knife. Try not to bleed on the pork loin. At the center of the table, the candles flickered. Conversation rose. Laughter echoed off the walls. Someone started humming a carol out of tune, and within minutes the entire table was singing with the loose, shameless joy only December snow could coax out of a person who'd spent too much of the year alone. Then came dessert. Clara had requested strawberry pancakes. Bill asked for sour cherry crisp. Cora brought out 3 lemon bars that had refused to set properly but were devoured anyway. Margaret served the final plate herself, a bowl of simple vegetable soup steam curling into the air like memory. She placed it in front of her empty seat at the head of the table. No one asked why. They knew. She raised her glass filled not with wine, but with broth, and smiled at the room, at the people who had become family, not through blood, but through butter salt and broken stories shared over cutting boards. I was told once, she began, voice soft, but certain, that a good meal is more than food. It's the fire that draws people in from the cold. It's the hand that stays when everyone else leaves. And when you share it honestly without performance or pride, it becomes a gift. Silence, warm, held. Margaret looked at Sean. His eyes were glassy, lips parted, but he didn't speak. She turned back to the group. My husband James once told me, a good meal is the last gift you ever owe the world. Give it like you mean it. She sat down. The room didn't erupt into applause. Instead, something better happened. Bill leaned back and said, well, damn, now I feel guilty for bringing store-bought gravy. The room burst into laughter. Joyce clinked her spoon against her teacup. To Margaret, the only woman in Willow Creek who can make you cry over turnips. Margaret held up her spoon in salute. Across from her, Sean reached for her hand under the table and squeezed. She didn't pull away. Outside the windows, the snow had thickened, soft drifts piling along the sills, turning the street into a painting. Inside the kitchen, lights glowed gold. The candles flickered low. The soup cooled slowly in its bowl. And the camera, if there had been one, would have pulled back through the frosted glass, capturing the final image of the long table. The mismatched chairs, the laughter, and at its center, a woman who had once been betrayed, silenced, overlooked. Now she was none of those things. She was simply present, seen. And as the shot widened and the music swelled gently, Margaret's voice echoed softly in memory. A good meal is the last gift you owe this life. Give it warm, give it whole, and give it without asking for anything in return. Fade to snow, fade to light, fade to full.